Welcome to the Pot of Inquiry, everyone. My guest today is a very interesting gentleman named Arthur Menard, who has started a company called HAVN Wear, which is an EMF protective clothing line. And he has some other very cool gadgets and accessories to mitigate EMF exposure. And in this episode, we'll follow up on some things that we've talked about before in previous podcasts about the physiological effects of EMF and how damaging it is for cellular function and cellular communication and oxidative stress and all of those cool things. But then we get into actually some of the things that are quite nuanced about what's going on with 5G versus 4G and how we can mitigate this. He has offered all of our listeners a generous 15% discount if you go to the havenwear.com website and use the code POI15. You'll be able to access his really great product at a discounted price. So we'll put that in the show notes for you as well, so you can reach out and get these items after you've heard this great podcast. So please enjoy this conversation that I have with Arthur Menard.
Welcome to the Pot of Inquiry. Ready for some thought-provoking cerebral whipping and the destruction of ridiculous medical dogma? Want to shift those stale, moldy old paradigms? Well then, don that thinking cap of yours. Get down in the cave and join our host, Dr. Stephen Barrett, for this week's episode. Let's start spelunking.
Welcome to the Pot of Inquiry, everyone, the podcast for human optimization and understanding. And I have a great guest today, Arthur Menard, and we're going to talk about EMF and how to mitigate it with some of the things that he's designed to protect us. So, Arthur, tell us about yourself, your background, how you got into this space, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, first of all, Stephen, thank you. Stephen, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here. I'm going to flip your question, actually, and start with how I got here.
Okay.
I grew up with two grandparents who battled cancer for all my life. And so from a very young age, I became pretty acutely aware of the fact that the choices I would make today would compound into my likelihood of staying healthy in the long run. That really led to a strong interest in longevity, an interest that culminated in a master's degree in engineering and biology. And my very first job out of college was studying the genomic patterns of prostate cancer. Through this job, I started learning about the link between EMF exposure and cancer. And I went down a rabbit hole and started diving a lot more into the science and realized that, one, we were at a situation that was very similar to the tobacco crisis back in 1950s, where we have enough scientific evidence today that EMF exposure has an adverse biological effect that can affect our health, both in the short term and the long term. And that we were going towards a world of more and more exposure through connected devices, internet, phones, 5G, etc. And that as this information would start getting out, because there's always this gap between scientific research and public awareness, the public would have a rightful need to be protected. And so HAVN was created as a solution so that we can keep on enjoying technology, because I am pro-technology before we dive into like everything that is bad about EMF. I want to say this straight away. I am pro-technology, and I love my phone and I love my tech devices, and that's why HAVN was created, so that we can all continue to enjoy the benefits of modern society without the potential downside associated with EMF exposure.
So let me ask you, what type of an engineer did you, or what engineering did you study?
Actually, broad engineering. Engineering schools in France train you on a variety of engineering topics. Mine had a strong focus on biotechnologies, and hence the double major of biology and engineering.
It's been my experience that when it comes to rabbit holes and deep dives and everything, that engineers go the deepest.
I mean, they can,
that's a
usually they learn how to dig, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then they're like pit bulls. Once they get a hold of something, they just never let it go. So
Yeah, I do have a little bit of an obsessive personality.
yeah. So let me ask you some general questions about EMF, because I think you brought up a couple of points there. I thought we definitely have to cover the information versus disinformation and I hate to call it big tech versus science, but you know kind of where I'm going on
Yep,
this,
absolutely.
and you mentioned the corollary of the tobacco situation where you had a big, well, you had in the tobacco case, it was agriculture. So you had this big agricultural lobby that had a huge amount of investment invested in the tobacco space. And to protect that, they wanted to suppress everything they could coming out, obviously, because they wanted to protect their financial fiefdom. And I see that there could be a lot of that in the EMF world as well. And you brought it up, so let's talk about that a little bit because
Yep.
I think after COVID and everybody getting gaslighted so badly on that disaster, that it seems like this is kind of an interesting thing of why it's being, suppressed or at least not, it's not relegated to the front page.
Yeah. You mentioned a very interesting point about good science versus bad science.
Mm-hmm.
And this is unfortunately something that for the majority of the population, it's really hard to distinguish the two. And something that it has been used in the tobacco world by companies to continue funding low quality studies that were disproving the fact that that smoking could give you lung cancer.
Right.
And for many, many years, they continued funding those studies and funding and pushing really hard from a PR perspective and from a lobby perspective to avoid the truth getting out. When it comes to EMF, there is a really interesting article that was written on The Guardian that I encourage everyone to read that was published in 2017 or 2019 called The Inconvenient Truth Between Cell Phone Radiation and Cancer. Fascinating article, which I'm going to try my best to summarize their key findings, which was the concern around EMF started in 1990. And when the cell phone industry first started getting sued for brain cancer, they started a program called the Wireless Technology Research Program.
Wait, say that again. What was it called?
Wireless Technology
Okay.
Research Program,
Okay.
WTR,
Okay.
which was headed by Dr. Carlo. In 1999, the director of the program, Dr. Carlo again, reported that the risk of brain tumor was more than doubled in the mobile phone users, and that there was a correlation between the brain tumor and the side of the head where the phone was typically held. And he urged the cell phone industry leaders to inform consumers about those potential risks. And shortly after those warnings, the program was shut down.
Okay.
But the industry has continued to fund scientific studies. If you look into the 2000s, then there was a clear divide between industry-funded studies and independently funded studies. When you looked at the studies altogether blended, 55% of studies showed an adverse effect and 45% showed no adverse health effect. And so you could say, well, studies are divided, it's unclear. But then when you look at the source of funding of the studies, you're finding that actually closer to 80% of independently funding studies found adverse health effect, while about only 20% ish of the industry-funded studies found adverse health effects. So again, you're essentially this was based on a 2006 review of Dr. Henry Lay on 326 studies, if I remember correctly. So this goes against to show that there is, when it comes to different industries, there is always a big push towards funding studies to protect your own interests. And to date, there is about 2,200 peer-reviewed studies that link EMF to adverse health effects that include higher risks of DNA damage and cancer, of developing neurological disorders and cardiovascular disease. This is enough today scientific evidence to warrant a safety principle. And that safety principle, when it comes to at least the amount of radiation our devices are emitting, has not been updated since the 1990s, where the amount of radiation or EMF that any device could emit was based off exposure times that were much shorter compared to today. If you think about the brick phone that you were using once a week versus the wearables that you wear every day, and your cell phone that you use 6 or 7 hours per day for a lot of people. And they were based off heat exposure instead of what we believe now is the mechanism of harm of EMF, which is the interaction between those radiation and our cellular communication mechanisms, and particularly our voltage-gated calcium channels. So the science has evolved, but we haven't really seen anything move from a regulation perspective.
Now, do you think this is because, at least here in the United States, because of lobbying interests and suppression, or is it just it's not a topic that has fallen into vogue yet?
I think I can't speak for the lobbying part because this is nowhere near my specialty.
Right.
But I think it's always nuanced in the world, and there is a lot of money in telecommunications, so I'm sure there is and again, like, we're looking at industry funded studies versus non-industry independently funded studies. So
Right.
I'm sure lobbies and industries play a role in this too. But also it's an inconvenient truth, right? It's really inconvenient to talk about EMF from your cell phone being potentially harmful because we rely so much on those technologies. With
Right.
that being said, some of the most recent studies that came out were done by the NIH, and particularly the National
Right. And that's Institute of Health.
Yes, and the National Toxicology Program ran a 10-year study on rats, which showed clear evidence of significant DNA damage when exposed to cell phone radiation that were the cell phone radiation that we were using in the 2010s, so closer to 450 megahertz, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on this one, but very different type of radiation than the one we use today, where the frequencies has gone up significantly to be able to transmit more data at faster speed, and so where our exposure is essentially much higher than the study that was done. But this is again a case of the science lagging behind the level of exposure that we have because our exposure has been increasing so significantly in recent years too.
Well, it sounds to me this might be a twofold situation, because we've gone from, as you mentioned, a lower frequency, and I don't know if they called that 2G or 3G back then. I don't know, but we're now, the big deal a few years ago was going from 4G to 5G. So you have this massive increase in, let's call it dosage, for lack of a better way to put it. And then we're more addicted to the iPhone and your cellular phone, smartphone now than you were in 2010, because there's more goodies on it. There's more, apps, and it's so you've got twofold increase in exposure because the dosage is higher now and the time that you're dosing is higher, right?
Yep. Your cumulative exposure as well is so much higher than what you had in the past. Just in this office here, I've got 36 Wi-Fi signals that I'm able to get onto. And that is not counting 5G, which requires 10 times more towers than 4G to have the same coverage. But we're not removing the 4G towers when we're installing the 5G towers. So you need 10 times more towers, and you're keeping the original 4G towers as well. So Our exposure
is that because the 5G has to piggyback on the existing 4G?
No, I think this is just the way they've done the rollout, and you can see on your phone that sometimes you don't have access to 5G and then it's 4G.
Right.
It's just a different type of waves as well, where essentially 5G have a smaller wavelength, meaning they travel less far, but a higher frequency, so they are more powerful. So in order to have those more powerful waves, you need more antennas because they cover less distance. But I'm not entirely sure how the rollout is going and if antennas are being removed. But what is for sure is that over the last few years, we're becoming increasingly connected. Self-driving cars, for instance, heavily rely on EMF in order to communicate with their servers, and we're just continuously increasing the power of those radiation and the amount of radiation that we're exposed to.
So to give us a perspective, like let's say if 4G on a scale of 1 to 10 was a 4, what would 5G be?
It would be a 40.
A 40 on our scale of 1 to 10.
Somewhere in that vicinity, 20 to 40.
That's a pretty damn big difference, isn't it?
In frequencies, right? And now frequency doesn't necessarily correlate with that on a direct one-to-one. Is not necessarily a one-to-one direct correlation on health effect or how it impacts our bodies. So I do want to preface with that as well, and also saying that there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. We don't have all the answers today, and I certainly can't pretend to have them. And when it comes to how much is too much, is a big question. But we know that even at lower frequencies and lower cumulative exposure than today, the studies have shown that there is a biological effect of those radiation on our cells, and that it can increase oxidative stress and ultimately our risk of developing chronic conditions such as cancer, neurological disorders, etc.
So are there any studies that show the difference in pathological negative effects of 4G versus 5G?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware.
Yeah, but so it'd be kind of interesting to see that. I mean, empirically, you would think that you would have maybe a higher incidence. And I think what the primary cancer is glioblastoma.
Yep.
That is associated with the iPhone or any cellular phone. That would be very interesting to know.
I think one of the challenges, some of these studies, especially if we're looking at cancer.
Before we continue with this great discussion, I just want to take a quick break to acknowledge this week's sponsor. I'm constantly exploring new avenues to enhance well-being and address any health concerns. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to an exciting supplement called STEM Regen, which I take daily and genuinely believe could revolutionize your health journey as well. STEM Regen stands out as a game changer in the realm of wellness. Crafted from 5 potent plant extracts, it boasts a remarkable ability to stimulate the release of your body's own stem cells from your red bone marrow. Why is this significant? Well, stem cells are the superheroes of our body's natural repair system. They possess the extraordinary capacity to morph into various cell types, aiding in tissue regeneration and repair. As we age, the quantity of circulating stem cells in our system reduces significantly, impairing our body's ability to heal and rejuvenate itself effectively. STEM Regen steps in to counter this decline by kickstarting the release of stem cells into circulation, thereby bolstering your body's innate repair mechanisms. Once unleashed into your bloodstream, these mobilized stem cells actively seek out areas of damage or injury, initiating the healing process. By incorporating STEM Regen into your daily routine, you're essentially empowering your body to tap into its own regenerative prowess more efficiently. I firmly believe that STEM Regen could be a valuable addition to your wellness regimen, especially if you're seeking to fortify overall health and vitality, accelerate tissue repair, or expedite recovery from injury or illness. This first of its kind stem cell mobilizer is changing the game in regenerative medicine. Don't wait to unleash your body's innate healing capabilities. Visit stemregen.co/Dr. Steven, that's with a PH, and use the code SBPOD to get a 15% discount off your first order of StemRegen.
Are between the time of exposure or initial exposure to the moment you're going to be developing any kind of cancer, it takes years, and so those studies also take a lot of time. 5G is getting deployed in the last couple of years,
Right.
and actually some countries and some cities like Brussels, in Belgium, for instance, have halted 5G development and deployment, sorry, over concern around the fact that we haven't researched what the effect of 5G are on the human body compared to other technologies that we had before. The reality is even the research on previous technologies is not looking necessarily great when it comes to the fact to it being safe. Now, again, what I also want to say is, like, I'm not saying that we're going to die tomorrow from EMF exposure. What I am saying is we know now, based on the existing research, that it is very likely EMF exposure is currently having an adverse health effect on our cells, and we have identified a main biological pathway by which this exposure impacts us.
Well, let's go into that. So, because I think a lot of people have a conceptual difficulty in this thing that's invisible, but yet it's affecting human pathology. So, what is the primary pathomechanics of EMF on cellular function? Is it DNA damage?
Ultimately, but it is so. Actually, let's back up a little bit and tackle. I'm going to use that question to also tackle a misconception, which is ionizing radiation versus non-ionizing radiation.
Okay.
This is something that has been pushed in the media quite a bit when talking about cell phone radiation or EMF in general, which is, well, they are non-ionizing radiation.
Right.
So they cannot impact our DNA. Ionizing radiation are X-rays, gamma rays. They're really high frequency radiations that can directly dislodge electrons from our DNA and therefore increase risks of cancer. EMF are non-ionizing, meaning their frequency is not high enough to directly dislodge an electron. With that being said, that does not mean that there is not another pathway that can trigger DNA damage. And this is what scientists have been focusing on. And as I mentioned before, the NIH, via the National Toxicology Program, found strong evidence of significant DNA damage from that exposure. And today, the most widely accepted theory as to why is by disrupting the cellular signaling pathways that exist in our body. So we have trillions of cells, right? And those trillions of cells communicate with one another via various mechanisms, and one of them are electrical signals, and particularly voltage-gated channels. And one of the channels that have been studied the most are VGCCs, voltage-gated calcium channels.
Right.
Those VGCCs are activated by an electrical current. EMF are electromagnetic frequencies, and the electric component of those frequencies is thought to activate those voltage-gated calcium channels, where to essentially disrupt their activity and to create an abnormal influx of calcium ions into the cells.
Calcium is one of the destructive things, and in most pathology and cancer, you see calcium. It's not it's a marker that you don't necessarily want to have.
Yep, it's good for your bones, but it's not necessarily good for when you have an excessive calcium entry in your cells, because it is the starting point of a series of damaging biochemical reactions, which ultimately, a lot of it happens in the mitochondria, and the ultimate substrate is the production of reacting oxygen species, which are also known as free radicals, or not exactly the same thing, but it's and those free radicals in turn can damage DNA, but also damage the cell and ultimately the tissue by creating a state of oxidative stress.
So there's a couple of pathological pathways here going on with EMF. Then the activity, let's call it the electrical communication interruption
Yep.
Portion of it, and then also the reactive oxygen or the oxidation, the ROS is going to be cellularly damaging as well, adds to chronic inflammation.
Which can add to chronic inflammation, absolutely. Can create DNA damage. And ultimately, we know that oxidation and oxidative stress is at the root cause of a lot of today's modern diseases, as well as, or is one of the root causes, I should say, of a lot of today's modern diseases, and can contribute also to chronic conditions, symptoms. And so you hear about stories from, if you look at the Lyme disease community, or people with tinnitus, and you hear of stories of reducing EMF exposure and having relief in their symptoms. That is not to say that the EMF exposure is causing the disease in itself, but can contribute in enhancing the symptoms of that chronic condition.
Well, and I think this brings us to an important point about longevity and human optimization, because if you are metabolically in tune and you're kind of tuned up from a physiological standpoint, you might have a better response to these EMF exposures. It kind of reminds me of that character in Better Call Saul, that he pulled out all of his electronics in his house. When you went to visit him, you had to put your watch and your cell phone in the mailbox, leave it outside, and then he's wrapped up in tinfoil and the whole thing. And I think that there are just some human beings that their physiology is impaired that makes them much more highly susceptible to any type of threat, whether it's some other thing that's causing inflammation or that they're a little bit immunosuppressed or who knows what. But we can get into talking a little bit about that more, but I would think that would be the same thing with the brain cancer.
There is a condition that is increasingly recognized. It's been in the medical community. It's not recognized yet in the United States, but it is recognized in France and in Australia now, which is EHS, Electromagnetic Hypersensitivity Syndrome, which are people who are more susceptible to EMF, to feel the effect of EMF exposure. And part of the symptoms that they share are brain fog, migraines, fatigue, and sometimes tinnitus as well, which is one of the reported symptoms. And it's estimated that about 4% of the population, potentially as high as 10, is suffering from EHS and might not know about it. But then, as you mentioned, I think everyone's biology is going to be different. And depending on also what's happening with your own body, you might react differently to EMF exposure. And similarly to why some people smoke like chain smokers for their entire life and live to 90 and never get sick. And then you have people who die from secondhand smoking, developing cancer this way. And so one of the misconceptions I think that people have is, well, if studies are showing so much virus effect of EMF, like why would it have such a wide range of impact? Like this can't be real, right? But the reality is, like, not everyone's going to suffer from like all that wide range of effect, and some people are not going to be affected at all, and other might react differently. And for some people, it might be more of a higher risk of cancer, while other it's going to increase risks of neurological disorders, and for some people it's not going to do anything. But we don't have enough data at this stage to even know how bad our current levels of exposure are on all of these. We just know it's likely to increase the risk associated with them.
So let me ask you the question about EHS, this electromagnetic hypersensitivity syndrome.
Yep.
which, man, that's about a $25 word there. But so is there a screening mechanism, or how are they making their diagnosis? Is it basically reported from the patient, the
Um,
signs that they have, or how are they making that diagnosis?
yeah, I actually am not an expert on how doctors are diagnosing this today. And like I said, it's a condition that is not universally recognized as a medical diagnosis today.
Right.
So I'm sure most doctors won't even be able to test for something like this. I believe it's more often than not patients who are removing things out of their lives or adding things in their lives to try and figure out where those symptoms are coming from, and who notice relief when not exposed to EMF, or who can sense those symptoms coming when exposed to EMF. Some patients have participated in studies, so I believe, where there are placebo and and where they're exposed and not exposed unknowingly to measure if those symptoms show up or if it's a psychosomatic condition.
Right.
And again, like, it's very new field when it comes to this, but where the recent research is pointing oxidative stress as one of the key factors behind the symptoms that people with EHS are suffering. And again, EMF might not be the sole factor responsible in those symptoms developing, but potentially an aggravating factor, which makes it that those symptoms are more likely to show up when exposed to EMF for that specific set of individuals.
Well, I think that's a great point. I mean, we're running around in this world that we have now between glyphosate, atrazine, all of the things that we're trying to fight in processed foods, and then you got people that are not sleeping well and they're not exercising, and so they're just they're metabolically and physiologically impaired. So it would make sense that this is going to be additive to the stress that they're
Right.
under. And
Right.
so, I mean, we're fighting a lot of battles right now, just walking around on this planet. People don't
Absolutely.
people don't think about it that way. And I think you have to kind of posit it in the frame of a lot of this stuff are poisons, but they are very slow acting poisons, and you don't have any negative effect maybe initially. And like you said, it could be decades before you start to see,
Yep.
adverse effects from these exposures. So it's sometimes hard to get everybody on board when it's not so readily obvious to their day-to-day function.
Yep. Absolutely.
You know,
And those are cumulative as well, right?
Right.
As you mentioned, which is for someone who's sleeping well, exercising, eating healthy, the likelihood that EMF or pollution or plastics will impact their quality of life is likely lower than someone who's on top of this, not eating healthy,
Right.
drinking unfiltered water, etc. So the more of those choices that you make, again, the more likely you are to be healthy in the long run.
Well, let's get into a little bit of the technology that you've got going on with your clothing and everything, because I think that's a cool thing. So let's talk about first, before we talk about it, I'd like to know what was the motivation that drove you to develop this, and then we'll talk about how it mitigates EMF.
Yeah. Well, it's the engineer brain, right?
Yeah, right.
I had my scientist hat when I dove into the research behind EMF, and realizing that we were going towards a world of more exposure, not less exposure,
Right.
that if we didn't want to deal with the consequences of that exposure, we had to do something and build a solution. Now, all this EMF exposure exists because our devices are connected, and that's their way of transmitting data wirelessly, right?
Right.
And so we can't do anything to prevent that exposure at a device level unless we're impairing the capability of the device to communicate with the internet or with a cell phone tower or with other devices. And so the only thing we can realistically do then is to prevent EMF from reaching the body. Um, from that fact, then we set out to figure out, well, what can we even do that? And we found out that NASA spacesuits had a layer of electromagnetic shielding because astronauts in space are exposed to an enormous amount of radiation. And so we took the same physical principle, which is electromagnetic shielding, similar to a Faraday cage, and we decided to create a fabric that would use that physical principle while retaining a traditional form factor of a fabric. And I'm currently wearing the t-shirt for people who are watching us on video. And so we're using a proprietary mesh of silver fibers to create a technology called Wave Stopper, which blocks 99.7% of EMF from 450 megahertz to 40 gigahertz, which covers the entire spectrum of today's electronic devices that you would use as a consumer. And then we integrate that technology into clothing that protects your essential organs. So we started with underwear to protect your genitals. Then we moved on to hats to protect your brain, and a t-shirt to protect your essential organs, starting with your heart. And then we expanded to gaiters for your thyroid, pajamas, hoodies. We now have home products such as blankets and laptop pads, and we're expanding towards more products as well.
And now a message from our sponsor. I've been taking Nature's Marvels bioregulatory peptides for more than 3 years now on a very consistent basis. It's an integral part into my wellness journey, and I can't imagine not even going on this journey without that. These are designed with cutting-edge science to optimize and restore your body's natural processes. After 3 years, I can say without a doubt, this isn't another wellness product that just gets pushed to the back of the cabinet. This is the real deal for human optimization and longevity. Start your journey today with Nature's Marvels. Our website's below. Yeah. So explain what a Faraday cage is, because there's some folks out there that probably won't know what that is.
Right. So a Faraday cage is essentially going to talk about electromagnetic shielding more so than a Faraday cage, because we're not going to have to talk about grounding. But the physical principle behind electromagnetic shielding is that an electromagnetic radiation is comprised of an electric field and a magnetic field. When interacting with a conductive fiber or conductive metal, that radiation can be deflected and dissipated. The key in creating an effective electromagnetic shield is to make sure that the grid that is being created is tight enough for the radiation not to go through. So you're going to need to have the size of the hole of the grid to be smaller than the wavelength of the radiation. That's a little bit of a mouthful. So the best way to picture this is imagine a fence and imagine you going through that fence. If the size of the hole of the fence are smaller than your head, you're not going to go through.
Right.
And then the second principle is you need enough coverage to essentially have that dissipation effect and not to act as an antenna. So the other analogy that I can give is that fence is not very useful if it's 1 feet long. If it is a few miles long, that's going to be a lot more effective at keeping people out. So in creating that electromagnetic shield, what's really important when it comes to EMF protection on the body is to make sure we're surrounding the organ that we're trying to protect and that we're giving it enough surface coverage for it to have that dissipation effect and that reflection effect. But hopefully that was a good enough explanation.
Yeah, no, that was a great, that was much better than I remember from high school physics, the topic, and they had an illustration of a complete steel hollow ball.
Right.
And you could put a man in there and he could touch the insides of that steel ball, and they could hit it with a huge amount of electricity, and it would just push it all on the outside of the sphere, and the man wouldn't get shocked on the inside. So it sounds like you're kind of creating that same type of a Faraday cage around the body with your clothing.
Yep, it's a way cooler analogy that you're giving compared to me and my fence, I gotta say.
It's amazing how you remember things that, are, try to illustrate these different concepts and everything. But so that's very interesting. But what I was going to say is that in that illustration of the Faraday cage that I just gave, there would be a higher, let's call it an EMF content on the surface on the outside. Is that the same that you would see with your clothing? If you would measure it, obviously, I don't know, would an EMF meter show that it would be higher on the outside as it's repelling it versus on the inside, it's going to be blocking it, right?
Yeah, you're gonna have, as I mentioned, the mechanism is a mix of absorption and dissipation, which is not gonna stay on the fabric.
Right.
Some of the energy of those EMF is gonna be absorbed by the silver fiber in itself, and the induced currents within the fiber are gonna convert part of this into heat, and that heat is gonna get dissipated.
Okay.
The other mechanism is reflection.
Okay.
So the high conductivity of the fiber is going to reflect the electromagnetic waves and generate essentially an opposite electromagnetic field that is going to reflect the incoming EMF, similar to a mirror that would reflect light. So you do have potentially a little bit of an increase on the outside, but because we are living in a world of so much ambient exposure, and the fact that EMF also gets progressively dissipated the further away from the distance, or the more distance they need to travel, the more dissipation, natural dissipation they occur. Some of the waves will be reflected, but they also will be much less strong than when originally coming onto the fabric, because part of it is going to be absorbed and dissipated, and part of it is going to just travel further distance from it in the air, which is going to, again, absorb part of it.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Now, I saw something on your website where you just got some kind of a contract from the United States Air Force to protect the pilots.
Yeah, we were awarded an STTR contract by the U.S. Air Force for essentially exploring how our technology wave stopper can help protect exposed military personnel. And pilots in particular are sitting in an environment that is very high in terms of EMF exposure.
Right.
But they're actually not the only ones when it comes to high risk professions from an EMF perspective. Talking about medical professionals, since I know a lot of your audience are physicians out there, if you're in a hospital or clinic setting, a lot of the devices in an ICU or even a surgery room are going to be devices that are communicating wirelessly, and the amount of EMF exposure is really high there as well, which in turn was, I believe, back in days when they were asking you to turn off your cell phone when you were entering a hospital, was partially because it could disrupt some of those EMF.
Kind of like they want you to turn your cell phone off when you fly on a commercial flight now.
Right.
I'm not so sure that has anything to do with what they claim about interruption of their air traffic control communications and all of that. But I think it's just they don't want people on the plane bullshitting on their phones all the time.
They've changed the frequencies recently so that the cell phone frequencies are not interrupting, are not on the same frequency band as the plane communication. With that being said, don't use what I've just said as an excuse to not turn off your phone when you're getting in a plane. Please follow all the safety procedures.
Yeah. So very interesting. So, Arthur, tell folks how they can get your. Well, let me ask you one more question too about the clothing. How durable is it from a wearing standpoint, washing it? It sounds like it's pretty darn sophisticated and has a lot of really cool material in it. How does that correlate with being able to wash it, dry it, those types of things?
Yeah, that was a lot of the work that we did was essentially, when it comes to creating an electromagnetic shield, it's easy. And you took the example of Better Call Saul.
Yeah.
We could take a sheet of aluminum and then wrap it around our body, and we're good to go. All the work that we did was creating a fabric that would look the same as traditional fabric, feel the same, so be as comfortable to wear, and also be easy to maintain. So our fabric is washable, preferably on cold, and you can ideally you hang dry it versus putting it
In a dryer.
in a dryer. And if you do put it in a dryer, ideally on low heat, think of it as a more sensitive fabric that you would take better care of than your traditional cotton. But still, again, mesh and washable, ideally hang dry or low heat, tumble, and it's going to last you for a little longer due to the way our construction works. The wear and tear tends to be a little less than what you'd have in a typical garment, but the efficacy of the solution is going to last you for 3 to 5 years, depending on how long, how often you wash them, and how intensely you wear them.
Right. No, that's great. Well, before I ask you to tell us how they can get this great stuff, if you were going to purchase one thing to protect yourself from the EMF, which would it be that you would recommend?
That's a tough one. It's going to depend on who you are. If you're someone who carries their cell phone in their pocket all day, then I would start with the underwear, because that is, you have a device that is, your exposure is inversely proportional to the distance, meaning the farther your device is, the exponentially less radiation you're getting. So when you have something that is against your body, this is where you're going to have the most exposure from that one device. So for me, this is why we started with underwear. Now, I also know that the blanket is extremely popular amongst our first-time buyers because of the versatility of it. You can use it at the office, at home, on a bed, for multiple members of the family. So it is probably the easiest product to start using at the beginning. But what I would encourage everyone to do, which I'm going to go back to the beginning of this podcast where you shared, it's an invisible exposure. This is something that we heard from our customers all the time. And so we recently started offering for sale devices that are called EMF meters, which are small devices that allow you to measure the amount of EMF that you have in your home, or that your devices emit at different areas of your home. We source the best. This is not something we created. We sourced the best one we could find for the most price-friendly and user-friendly combination. You can also go and buy one on Amazon if you prefer. As long as you don't buy a cheap one, which is only going to measure electrical currents. So we've done the work of sourcing what we believe is the best today on the market, and I would definitely encourage people to get one of those devices and test their homes, because you might find that your bed has your Wi-Fi router right next to your head, for instance, or that your office is against a cell phone antenna on the other side of the wall. This also might help you figure out that some devices that you thought were not emitting EMF or emitting a low amount of EMF are actually emitting a lot more than what you thought.
I think that's a super important point, because regardless of what the condition is, if a patient is educated on the reason of why you're going to do something, right? Rather than just saying to them, take this drug, you'll be fine. If you explain to them what it does, but the most important thing is for people to see metrics. Okay, so we're going to institute this treatment. We're going to check your blood 3 months down the line, and you're going to see a difference in whatever it is that we're measuring. And that resonates with people because it's a scorecard. It tells them that there is something going on, and oh, by the way, I'm doing it. So I would think that would be a huge thing, because in fact, I'm going to get a meter from you after we get off this show, because I want to order one so that I can check the different areas of my house. And I think number one place would be the bed. is that you're spending a third of your life in the bed.
Absolutely.
Right. So
Or
then
you
when
should
you,
be.
yeah, well, you should be. But then when you see that, it's like, oh my God, this stuff is here. I can't see it. I can't taste it. I can't feel it. I can't smell it, but I can see it on this meter. And then you put it behind the new piece of clothing that you've got, and you can look and go, oh yeah, this is real. Once people understand that things are real, compliance goes way up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And what you said, by the way, if anyone wants to test our product, is extremely important. If you're going to put the meter somewhere, put the meter inside the clothing, not the opposite, not the cell phone in the clothing and then the meter on the outside, because keeping radiation out is a very different thing than keeping radiation in. Think of a prison, right? They're designed to keep people out, not necessarily from coming in. It's going to be easier to go in than going out. Gotcha.
Okay, so Arthur, tell the folks, you've been very kind to offer all the listeners a discount code called that's POI, as in Pot of Inquiry 15, for 15% off. Tell everybody how they can get to your website and learn about this and start donning some of these protective clothes.
Yeah. People can find us at HAVNwear.com, and HAVN is written HAVN because there is no E because we're blocking EMF. Easy way to remember it. So HAVNwear.com. We have a whole collection of product, including pajamas, since we just talked about bed. But we also have a science page where you can access a white paper that gives you a lot more information about the science behind EMF. We've got over 1,000 physicians today that are recommending the product to their patients, so if you go to that science page, you'll understand why, and hopefully you get yourself some HAVN products.
Arthur, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for giving a great didactic explanation of some of these things, and quite frankly, it's still kind of a hard concept for a lot of people to grasp because of the fact that it's so below their radar. Thanks for designing this. I mean, this is a very useful and important technology. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me the platform to hopefully help people understand that topic a little better. And I'm hoping that all the listeners got something out of it. And if you did, share that episode with people you love, because there is very little awareness on the topic, and it's still very murky. There is a lot of bad actors as well out there that are not necessarily communicating the right way. I'm more talking about fake products and whatnot that exists and are tweaking the science in a way that is not real. And so I think the first step is being educated so that people can make the right choices for themselves.
Yeah, and I'd encourage everybody to really take a look at what you all are offering there, and if you have any skepticism at all, get the EMF meter and test your house. It's kind of like knowing do you have mold in your house?
Right.
Well, when you see that there's mold, you're pretty motivated to get it cleaned up. So I think that's
a great first step. Yeah.
So cool. Thank you so much, Arthur. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Well, folks, if you are over 40 and you are not using a supplement to augment nitric oxide production, you should really rethink that. This molecule is absolutely imperative to the health of so many bodily functions, not the least of which is cardioprotection. If you have any question on nitric oxide, I suggest that you register with Approved Medical Solutions and begin receiving their educational emails. I never miss a day of nitric oxide supplementation. That's how important it is. Long overdue, Approved Medical Solutions created the only nitric oxide replenishment formula without oxalates. Approved Medical Solutions does not use beet, spinach, or arginine. Approved Medical Solutions is proud to offer our audience their oxalate-free nitric oxide formula. If you are not a healthcare provider, you can still get started by going to approvedmedicalsolutions.com and use the code SBarrett at checkout, and you'll receive a 10% medical discount savings. You can register to receive educational emails without any purchase. For licensed practitioners, you too can go to approvedmedicalsolutions.com and get registered today. They have unique bundles for all of the full-fledged spelunkers of the Pod of Inquiry. Use Pod of Inquiry at checkout after registration. Here's a little secret. If you order their testing strips and test every patient for a few clinic days, you will see every one of them be deficient. When they see this result, they will want you to start them up immediately. Now, thanks to approved medical solutions, you can give them the best care without the worry of oxalates. I hope you all enjoyed today's show and got some truly empowering knowledge out of it. You can always follow up on anything we talked about in the show notes found at our website, podofinquiry.com. If you think you might have tickled just a few neurons inside that cerebral cortex, please spread the word to your friends and colleagues and tell them that they need to get spelunking. Also, if you can take a minute to leave a review on your podcast provider of choice, and especially Apple Podcasts, that would greatly help the show and be so appreciated, provided it's positive. And if not, then just keep your pie hole shut and stay down in that cave. Let's keep spelunking.
This podcast is designed for informational purposes only and does not constitute any medical or surgical consulting advice or imply a development of any physician-patient relationship. The opinions of guests who are featured on the show are not necessarily the opinions of Dr. Barrett or the production team. This podcast is owned solely by Barrett Medical and Surgical Media, LLC. While the show is highly oriented for physicians and healthcare providers, anyone interested in the improvement of human performance and understanding will find us a welcome goblet to sip from, or guzzle. However, no representation or warranties are made in any way whatsoever on this podcast for any products, techniques, or other things discussed. Invited guests are not vetted by the Pod of Inquiry for their qualifications and may have a direct or indirect financial interest in what they present and discuss on the show. The Pod of Inquiry disclaims any responsibility from anything taken from the show and used personally or professionally. It is a responsibility of the listener to perform their own due diligence prior to the implementation of any ideas, products, techniques, or anything talked about on the show.